Respected colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As first of the two main divisions of the Bible, the Old Testament comprises the law, the prophecies, the messianic announcements, and the hagiographic legends of the Jewish Midland from the first millennium BC, echoing with the stark reality of the depicted stories. In that sense, the Old Testament is not a collection of sanctified mythology that glosses over the faults of its heroes. Instead, the personal narratives, the historic battles, the breathtaking tragedies, the passionate poetry, the lyrical verses, and the predictive prophecies combine to weave the colossal tapestry of the Old Testament. Hence, the men and women of the Old Testament are portrayed as they really were, as they have really suffered, mourned, bled, cried, and endured. As Philip Yancey says, on the pages of this great saga, one will find passionate stories of love and hate, blood-chilling tales of rape and dismemberment, matter-of-fact accounts of trafficking slaves, honest tales of high honor and treachery of war. On the pages of this historically profound testimony of ancient times, one encounters a plethora of humanity: patriarchs, kings, queens, priests, warriors, saints and sinners. They are all there, each playing a significant role in the centuries-long vibrant account of victories and tragedies, of heroes and traitors, of victims and commandments. They are larger than life and yet intensely human, belonging to the distant past and yet portrayed with such vividness and relevance that their stories come alive just like the seemingly inescapable destinies of people today. In that regard, one of the most striking characters of the Old Testament history in terms of his contribution to the expressive notion of sacrifice and devotion is the righteous Abraham, a key figure in the book of Genesis, an individual ennobled with the virtues of loyalty and confidence, commitment and liability, perseverance and resolution. As such, Old Testament Abraham has gained his rightfully deserved place on the pages of Christian patristic, as well as in the sphere of Christian iconography, both as a suggestively depicted portrait and as an actor in history determining events. An archaeological finding which has inspired this paper will be presented and explicated to you by my colleague Orhideja Zorova in the most illustrative and uplifting manner.
Layers of symbolic lie hidden in the decorative repertoire of medieval rings, their delicate and miniature format being an impediment to the hungry eyes of those eager to hear the meaning. Much of this exquisite narrative remains veiled and mysterious, unseen, but every once in a while, fortune favors those committed at staring at the smallest of finds, and after facing them with imaginary mental illness, they become cured of their blindness. I have visually already introduced to you my precious, but before verbalizing the due respect of this exquisite and unique depiction of the Old Testament patriarch in the treasury of Macedonian medieval rings, allow me to briefly present the origin and context of this unique find. The bronze ring is an in situ grave find from the necropolis of Zadna Reka Grmajte, formed and utilized simultaneously to the beginning and zenith of Samuel's state. More or less a small necropolis, whose burial rite and grave inventory show Christian provenance, one can presume that the population of this funerary ground was sufficiently middle class in following the latest trends of the Christian devotional jeweler. The bronze ring depicting the unique representation of Abraham's sacrificial offer was discovered in grave 21, dated in the 10th to 11th centuries, along with yet another bronze ring whose decoration is devastated and, quite intriguingly, with a biconical earring, not a pair but a piece. On this occasion, we would like to point that the in situ length of the skeleton was 1.70 meters, which in our humble opinion alludes to a male, though there are no anthropological data regarding the gender of the deceased. The Abraham ring was discovered on the left palm, no phalanx noted in the documentation's inventory, while its inner diameter is 2.5 centimeters, once again pointing to a male carrier. Allow us now to proceed to the details of the iconography of the miniature scene. The oval head of the bronze ring is accentuated by punctuated dots, thus creating the atmosphere denotative of Mount Moriah, the site where Abraham was instructed to sacrifice his one son to God by God's will. At the center of the scene, there is a stylized male figure whose arms are wide and open, holding a knife in the left hand. In the left part, there is a stylized representation of a table, altar, while on the right side is a depiction of an obscure fetal or zoomorphic figure, or an attempt for visualizing both. Thus, this scene could not be anything else but one stylized representation of the verses in Genesis 22:1-12, that is, the sacrifice of Abraham or the sacrifice of Isaac as a more common reference. Abraham is presented in a garment which is artistically similar and stylistically analogous to the ring depictions, pulling their inspirations from the numismatic series of the time. But in this case, we believe that the dotted vertical row is denotative of an epitracheion vestment, a liturgical symbol of priesthood and pastoral role. Thus, he is iconographically invested with the patriarchal role given to him by the Old Testament verses. His hand risen in divine determination and obedience is denotative of the moment when Abraham, just about to slaughter his son, is stopped by God, who says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Whether the fetal zoomorphic lines on the right of Abraham are an attempt to sketch the thicket and the sacrificial ram is difficult to say, since the media carrying this scene is far too small for detailed iconographical elaboration. Thus, we can only assume that the artist's intention was to indicate the obligatory elements of this Old Testament scene in an artism of his extent, at which point we are faced with the crucial and far more important question of the ontology of this scene. Namely, the most striking essential of this archaeological item is the scene selection, a representation previously not seen on a media such as a ring dated in the time frame of Macedonia Byzantina, the iconographical selection of which, and furthermore its symbolical meanings, raise intrigue and fascination. Allow us to broaden the context of this depiction, both chronologically and territorially, in order to point to what we believe are the closest analogies to the ring's iconography in terms of artistic, format, and symbolical similarities. Following a chronological order, we present few examples of various provenance, whose decorative matrices are similar to the grave 21's ring. A gem ring, dated in 5th to 6th centuries, of unknown, probably Asia Minor origin, on which the garnet stone inset in gold is decorated with the representation of Abraham's offering of the vine Isaac, that is his son to God. A seal from Dumbarton Oaks, dated in the 11th to 12th centuries, the obverse of which depicts the sacrificial offer of Abraham, supplemented with the depiction of the Manus Dei as an indication of God's presence and intercedence. A Judeo-Christian pendant depicting a menorah and the sacrifice of Isaac, of unknown origin, broadly determined as 8th century terminus antiquem. We find this pendant's iconography quite similar to the grave 21's ring. Last of the forma formans and symbolical analogies is the so-called Gnostic amulet, a late Byzantine amulet of unknown provenance. The representation of the righteous Abraham's obedience is an iconographical inspiration found onto other media, such as the 5th to 6th centuries bronze Byzantine relief, as well as the 6th to 7th centuries Byzantine terracotta tile, thus offering a wider carrier forms, which undoubtedly testify to a deeper symbolic of this scene for the Byzantine society, since these objects are more or less point breaks between the canonical and the individual manifestations of religious belief during the Byzantine era. Byzantine objects of personal devotion a plethora encompassing a wide range of media referred to as phylacterium and used as protection against the unbearable lightness of being, is our preferred proposed typology for this particular ring, the depiction of which echoes back to the prehistory of Christianity in what we anticipate is a laconic didactic treatise on the subject of faith as an ultimate apotropaic instrument. Alluding to such function, the ultimate meaning of which remains veiled, the Grave 21's ring opens some new scholarly meditations in the sphere of jewelry's decorative iconography, and hopefully some new ideas and insights inside this fountain of motives.
If we now turn our attention to the horizon of art history, particularly the one encompassing medieval fresco ensembles, we will certainly find that the scene of Abraham's sacrifice is a rare iconographic phenomenon in that domain as well. Speaking of the Byzantine monuments in the Balkan region, the most impressive composition depicting this biblical event is by all means executed in the monastery of Gracanica, where the fearful gaze of the old Abraham, the distorted figure of his terrified son, and the proportional silhouette of the landscape backdrop associative of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem create an expressive spectacle of a tragic yet festive ceremony of beneficial offering. However, the fresco painting from medieval Macedonia can also offer some visually interesting examples, among which the painted cycle illustrated in the altar space of the St. Sophia Cathedral in Ohrid is the most significant. Although the cycle starts at the southern border of the altar and continues towards the center counterclockwise, the compositions depicting the biblical story are iconographically well structured. The hospitality of Abraham in two episodes, the first one depicting the arrival of the angels in the plains of Mamre, and the second one visualizing the annunciation of the birth of Isaac by the angels, as well as the sacrifice of Abraham in 5 episodes, Abraham and his servants saddling the ass with the wood for the burnt offering. Abraham is leaving the servants to wait for him. Abraham and Isaac are heading to the designated spot for the offering. Abraham is stretching his hand to kill his son with a knife. And Abraham, hearing God's voice, and sees the ram as a replacement offering. Following the biblical tale in a consistent manner and uniting the two crucial chapters that refer to the designated role of Old Testament Abraham as a devoted follower, as well as God's favorite, the cycle at St. Sophia Cathedral's altar space emanates accentuated Eucharistic significance. The astonishing appearance of the angels in Abraham's habitat at Mamre as a symbolic hypostasis of the Holy Trinity, and the prediction of Isaac's birth as an Old Testament prefiguration of Christ, are complemented with the elaborated depiction of Abraham taking his son to be sanctified and sacrificed in the land of Moriah as an Old Testament prototype of Christ's sacrificial offering on the cross of Golgotha. Hence, if we have in mind that Moriah in Hebrew means the Mount of God, a place which in the book of Chronicles, as well as in Isaiah's and Zechariah's prophecies, refers to the site of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, then St. Sophia's cycle sublimes two ideological coordinates of the biblical story: the sophisticated notion of incarnation as an essential prerequisite of the messianic role of the Savior, and the designated location of the sanctified temple, where the sacrificial offerings were placed as the Eucharistic bread was laid on the altar table in the Ohrid Cathedral. In that regard, the Old Testament evidence of one righteous man's destiny heralds the elaborated synoptic substance of the predicted redemption of the entire mankind. On the account of that, the cycle depicting the story of Abraham was painterly executed in the second register of the fresco ensemble of St. Sophia's Bema, corresponding to the composition in which Christ blesses the Eucharistic bread placed in the center of the altar. In the horizon of its painterly expression, the cycle of Old Testament Abraham in St. Sophia's sanctuary is nothing but highly illustrative. The suggestively vivid motion of the angelic figures in the first episode of the depicted story, the proportionally festal arrangement of the three celestial beings around the dining table, the humble posture of the host who brings the offering of food to his heavenly guest, and the attentive, inquisitive gaze of the old Sarah who peeps from inside the household in the scene of Abraham's hospitality, permeate the visualization of the biblical verses with the expressive nuances of a tense and exciting spectacle. On the other hand, the decision of the iconographer to illustrate the process of Isaac's sacrifice in several episodes, comprised by a mutual frame, is due to the notion of the dramatic complexity of the act itself, which, as passionately described in the Bible, consists of an agonized preparation and unpredictable non-execution. Yet, the episode in which Abraham raises his hand in order to sacrifice his son Isaac, although positioned in the high left angle of the composition, reveals the overwhelming tragedy of the moment in the fearful, frightened, and helpless glance of the old man determined to kill his only child. The calm composures of the two servants, unaware of the forthcoming event, contrary to the suggestively agitated facial expression of the suffering father, the wide prospect of the first episode located in front of the architectural backdrops, contrary to the dense configuration of the hilly landscape of the subsequent sites, as well as the colorful resonance of hues of the right portion of the picture, contrary to the dark gamut of the palette in the left part of the vista where the drama takes place, are the aesthetic components of painterly execution of the emotional Old Testament narrative. Graphically sublimed when represented as symbolic ornament on archaeological artifacts, or elaborately illustrated within painterly ensembles, the sacrifice of Abraham, with all its visual coordinates, stands for one of the most compassionate iconographic spectacles in the creative language of medieval aesthetics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.